Hi, my name is Sam Bunzli. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at Opus and I work at the University of Melbourne Department of Surgery at St Vincent's Hospital. Thank you to the SOMA group for inviting me to present in this session on the topic of getting published. Now, in preparing for this talk, I tried to think of the things that would have been helpful for me to know at the start of my PhD journey, but also in the later stages of my PhD as I transitioned into a postdoc position. So I'll share with you today my thoughts on why publishing is important, what to publish, and my top tips on how to optimize the publication process. So I'm going to start with a pop quiz. Now, unfortunately, this presentation is pre-recorded, so it's not in real time, but you can anyway reflect on your thoughts for a moment here. So, publishing is important because A, to communicate research findings, B, to gain recognition in the field, C, to build your track record, or D, all of the above? My response would be D, all of the above. So publishing papers is how we communicate our findings, so how new discoveries are shared across the scientific community. So when different researchers replicate an experiment using the same methodology, they're applying one of the major principles of the scientific method. This is reproducibility. So maybe some of you will make a big scientific breakthrough that's published in the New England Journal of Medicine or is picked up by news outlets. But most of you are unlikely to have these big breakthroughs, but instead your paper will be cited by another paper, which will in turn be cited by another paper, and so on and so on. And in doing so, you're accomplishing what scientists aim to do, and that's to contribute to the knowledge base, a little piece of that knowledge, which is going to advance our understanding in our field, in this case, osteoarthritis. So publishing is how we move forward collectively to build that evidence base. But published papers are read by people beyond the scientific community, including clinicians and policymakers. Publications form the basis of guideline development, and they inform evidence-based clinical decision-making. Publishing is also important to put your name on the map, to show the scientific community that you're an emerging researcher working in this space. So evidence shows that one of the easiest ways to spot a rising star in the field is simply to find those who have published early and often. So a study in the US found that PhD first author publication was a predictor of future career outcome. So the higher the number of first author publications, the more likely PhD students were to go on to obtain a faculty or an academic position. So does this then mean that you should just publish, whatever, whenever possible? Well, no, quality matters. So what is a quality publication? The first point I would make here is that the authorship list matters. So in our field, the most prestigious positions on the authorship list are the first author and the senior or last author. So the first author is typically the person who led the project or contributed most to the work. The last author is typically the senior researcher. This might be the person who facilitated or supported the work. It's often your PhD supervisor. So while being a middle author may be viewed as being less prestigious than the first author, as a PhD student contributing as a co-author on a manuscript is an opportunity to learn, and that's going to help you when the time comes to publish your own first author publications. Now, co-authorship with leading researchers in the field is also viewed as an indicator of the quality of your publications, and it shows that you're on the radar of these national or international leaders. And just as an FYI, I found it interesting while I was preparing this presentation to look up what was a paper with the highest number of authors. And it's actually this Nature paper, which set a record in 2015 for having 5,000 co-authors. So while the first author on this Nature publication is probably set up for life, being the 2,500th author on this paper would also be pretty helpful in getting you on the academic ladder. And on that note, in addition to who you publish with, it also matters what journal you publish your work in. So impact factors are used to rank journals by their relative importance. So the underlying assumption of an impact factor is that journals with high impact factor numbers they publish articles which are more highly cited than journals with a lower impact factor. So a publication in a high impact journal would be seen as a higher quality than a publication in a lower impact journal. And there's no real cutoff for what constitutes a high or low impact factor. In our field of medicine and orthopedics, impact factors range from 74.69, so that's the highest journal in the field, the New England Journal of Medicine, and it ranges all the way down to 0. There are some journals without an impact factor, and any number in between. Look, typically, the journals that we would be targeting, and my team and my research, would range between around 13 to around 2. And I'll touch on this process a little bit later in my hot tips for optimizing the publication process. But when it comes to deciding where to publish, what we usually do is we would rank our target journals by impact factor and then aim to submit to the highest ranked journal. And you can find the impact factor simply by looking on the journal websites. And to identify the journals themselves, you could speak with your supervisors, the librarian, and there are also websites you can go to that rank journals too, such as the link down the bottom of the screen there. Now, another indicator of the quality of your publications is how many times they've been cited. So again, if I was, for example, preparing a fellowship application, I might state my H index number as a numerical indicator of how productive and influential I am as a researcher. So if I had a H index of 5, for example, this would mean that I have 5 publications that have been cited, each of them at least 5 times. Or if you're Prof Chung, as the case may be on the screen here, you have an H index of 80, which means you have 80 publications that have been cited at least 80 times. So that's something for us to strive for. Now, who you've been cited by matters as well. So maybe your work has been mentioned in guidelines or in policy documents. Maybe it's been picked up by news outlets. Maybe it's been really widely shared by clinicians on social media. And the Altmetrics website can help you to track these mentions, and this can be another indicator of the quality and the impact of your publications. Okay, so quality matters, but what should you be publishing in your PhD? Well, most OPUS PhD students would be looking to do a thesis by publication. So typically this means publishing a systematic review and then 2 or 3 also projects that make up your PhD thesis. Some might also be lucky enough to publish their chapter 1 as a narrative review, for example. A thesis by publication has obvious advantages. So it means that you're building your track record from the outset. And it means that much of your work has already been through a process of peer review, so that by the time you submit your thesis to your PhD examiners, you've already had that feedback. But the flip side of this is that publishing takes time. So this paper showed that the average time from submission of a manuscript to acceptance in 8 orthopedic journals was 113 days in 2015. And while this data here on the screen shows a trend towards reducing delays over that 5-year period the authors looked at, when you look at the website of these journals, the average time is still sitting around the 100-day mark. So time delays like that in the context of a 3-year PhD are a significant concern. So what can you do to optimize the publication process? Well, here are my top tips. So tip number 1, identify a target journal in the very early phases of writing your manuscript, even before you begin writing. So to identify a target journal, the first thing I think about is who the target audience is. Now, it sounds obvious, I know, but if your target audience is a clinician, then target a clinical journal rather than a methodological journal where clinicians are less likely to see it. Once you've identified who your target audience is, I would suggest ranking the potential journals by impact factor, like we spoke about just before. For each journal, then I go and have a look at what the scope of the journal is and what type of study do they publish. Now, I'm a qualitative researcher, and there are some journals that just don't publish qualitative research, the New England Journal of Medicine, for example. And so if you're publishing in a journal where the journal itself is not very familiar with the type of research you're publishing, it can be really hard for them to find good reviewers, and that can slow things up. Have a look at what the journals usually do publish. Can you pick up on some topics or themes that the journal seems to be interested in? And that are they then interested in the sort of fresh perspective that you could bring to the issue? Check out the formatting requirements for each journal as well. Now, again, as a qualitative researcher, when I am writing up my work, I require a more generous word count than some other types of publications. So I'll typically go for a journal which has a higher word count. But in addition to word counts, all journals have slightly different formatting requirements. Some might only allow a certain number of tables and figures, for example, which might be an issue for you. Some might request a summary of key practice points. Just small things like that, but knowing these requirements in advance can save you a lot of time down the track when it comes to submission. Now, another thing to take into consideration is how long the peer review process for that journal is. Have a look and see if you can find some information about this on their website, but also speak to your supervisors or others who have published in that journal. What were their experiences? Now, last year, I have a good example of this. I was talking to a colleague shortly after submitting a paper, and my colleague said, "Oh no, not that journal." And I wish I had spoken to them in advance, because this journal was notorious for a long, drawn out peer review process. And it took me a year from submission to get this paper to publication. So it's really important to find out what you can about the process itself of peer review. Now, the final thing I would suggest taking into consideration when it comes to choosing a journal is whether or not there are any publication costs involved. Now, traditionally, journals have been a subscription model rather than an open access model. So in a subscription model journal, the costs to accessing the article lie with the readers or the institutions that pay for the journal access. But in open access, the costs shift from the readers to the authors. And there are different models for open access. They include full open access. You can have a partially open access article where only some of the content of the article is made available online. And there's also a delayed access that some journals have as well, where after a period of time, the paper converts to being openly accessible. Now, there is some literature to support a citation advantage of open access, a higher visibility, a broader readership. In some fields, the citation rates of open access publications are estimated to be around 30% higher than for a subscription journal, but this may depend on the field. So there is a little bit of evidence out there to say that the biomedical sciences, the social sciences, and economics receive more citations, in an open access rather than a subscription journal. But there is some evidence to say that in the fields of medicine and health sciences, for example, open access doesn't have this extra advantage. It might just be that the jury's out, but it might just be the time is a factor here as well. Maybe some of those prestigious medical journals, some of them are going through a transition from subscription to online. So this just might be something that we'll see more of down the track. But look, a key downside to an open access publication is the cost. These are typically upwards from $2,500 US. So that's a really significant consideration that you need to take into account. Another drawback of the move towards open access publishing is the rise in the prevalence of predatory journals. Now, this figure is a little bit hard to see here, but I'll talk you through predatory journals first. It's estimated that more than 10,000 predatory journals produced over 400,000 papers in 2014 alone, which is quite extraordinary. So predatory journals are typically money-making schemes, and they're not peer-reviewed, which means that there's a real potential here for these sort of journals to really compromise scientific advancement. Now, these journals are also not indexed, so it makes articles really much harder to find. And as I said, it's a little bit hard to read, but there's a nice algorithm published in this journal here of advanced nursing, which helps researchers, especially newer researchers, to identify what would be a potentially predatory journal. So now you've identified the journal you want to publish in, now what? And it sounds silly, but now get writing. I usually find it easiest to start with the findings section first and to leave the introduction to the end. But when you're writing up those findings, make sure you check, you double check, you triple check the accuracy of these results. Errors can slip through the cracks, and while it is possible to publish a retraction down the track, it's not a good look, and it will make people question the integrity of your work. When referencing, cite seminal articles in the field, not everything that you've ever read. And because citation metrics matter, consider citing articles that are co-authored by your team, maybe citing articles that are published in the target journal. This shows the editors that the article is a good fit for the journal, but it also contributes to their own impact metrics. Another tip here is don't self-plagiarize. Sometimes you might not even know that you're doing this. We often have very set ways of phrasing things in our minds, which are really easier to reproduce when you're writing. But we've had editors return our students' work for self-plagiarism before. So now we ask our students to run their manuscripts through a plagiarism software before submitting. Follow the reporting guidelines for the type of study that you're writing up, and this will help you to structure your manuscript. Some journals will request that you follow a certain reporting and style guidelines, so just make sure that you're familiar with those. Be concise. This is a really hard one, which many people, including myself, really struggle with. But keep in mind that no one ever said, "I wish that paper was longer." Think carefully about your title. The title of an article really matters. It's the first thing the reader will see, so it helps people decide whether they're going to read the rest of the article or not. So what makes an effective title? Well, the figure on the left was a paper published in Nature News, which suggested that shorter titles receive more citations, and evidence suggests that the optimal length is somewhere between 10 and 15 words. Punctuation is also important. Commas and colons have been shown to increase citations, but articles where the title have question marks or exclamation points apparently are less frequently cited. Include keywords that help researchers find your article when using search engines, and make sure that your title accurately reflects the key concepts of your article. So my third tip for optimizing the publication process is to make sure that you seek out and you receive plenty of feedback. Getting a full first draft of your manuscript on paper can be really daunting, and you might feel really unsure or shy about sharing this with your supervisors or people you haven't worked with before in your authorship team. But rest assured that everyone has been in that position at some time, and we can all remember what it's like. Your supervisors and any senior co-authors will have experienced themselves as a peer review for journals. So consider their comments really carefully, as they'll reflect the comments of your typical reviewer. And I'll take this opportunity to mention what constitutes co-authorship. So the ICMJE recommendations are a set of guidelines that have been produced by the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors for standardizing the ethics, the preparation and the formatting of manuscripts submitted to journals. Now, according to the guidelines, to be a co-author, you have to meet 4 authorship criteria that are listed here, and I won't run through them, but I do recommend familiarizing yourself with those criteria. And journals will typically ask for a signed statement from each of the co-authors indicating that they've met these criteria. So you have your manuscript ready and it's time for submission. My top tips at this point are, number 1, to familiarize yourself with the submission guidelines. And so make sure that you have everything on hand for the submission process. This includes a cover letter. And I suggest speaking with your supervisor and asking them for an example or a template of a cover letter. Spend some time crafting a really strong argument to the editor as to why they should consider publishing your manuscript. Make sure that you have a correctly formatted manuscript. If the manuscript is uploaded incorrectly in the system, it's uploaded in the system but incorrectly formatted, it's going to be returned to you, and that just causes more delays. Have all the necessary forms on hand, the co-authorship forms, the conflict of interest statements signed by your co-authors, and make sure that you leave plenty of time to upload it. It always takes longer than you think, typically a couple of hours. So once I've done the full submission online, you'll end up with a PDF generated, and I suggest attaching that PDF and circulating it to your co-authors for their records. Keep track of the submission. So papers can and do get lost in the void. So check into the submission site regularly and look for status updates. If you submitted a paper months ago and it's still sitting with the editor and hasn't been sent out for peer review yet, you need to contact the editor about that and make sure that it's on their radar. And finally, my tips for the rebuttal process. So you've received the feedback from 2 or 3 reviewers, let's say, and they've requested a major revision. First of all, don't be disheartened. You should always see this as an opportunity to strengthen the manuscript. Try to reply promptly while the paper is still fresh in the reviewer's minds. And in the rebuttal, you want to respond to each of the reviewer's comments or concerns. Make it really difficult for the reviewers or the editors to say no this time round. So some tips for structure. I always like to start with an overarching statement of appreciation to the reviewers. And then I number each reviewer and each reviewer comment. So reviewer 1, comment 1.1. I bold each of the comments from the reviewers, followed by my reply, which will signpost then where I've made the corresponding changes in the manuscript. So in the example here, I have indicated that we've made changes under the heading study selection on page 5, and then I cut and paste the corresponding changes in the manuscript to this document here. So we start with the reviewer's comment, followed by my reply, followed by the corresponding changes in the manuscript. Always try to acknowledge the reviewer's perspective, and even if it's a comment that you don't agree with, I always find it useful to acknowledge that comment and to try to include a corresponding change somewhere in the manuscript. So it might be a comment mentioning it as a limitation in the discussion section of the manuscript, and then again cutting and pasting that corresponding change into your rebuttal document. And finally, I'm running out of time, but my final tips with that rebuttal is to be respectful to the reviewer's comments, to keep the tone really positive, to remember that the reviewers have volunteered their valuable time for this. And maybe it might be useful to speak to your supervisors about doing some peer review yourself, to put yourself in the shoes of the reviewers and get some of that experience, learn what it's like, what sort of things the reviewers are picking up on. And learn from rejection. Don't be disheartened. Pick up and keep going. And it's always an opportunity to make your manuscript stronger. And that's me. Off you go to get publishing.